is Tristan, review number 16. I have a malt that matches the weather right now because it's super nice out, and I wanted to go with something a little lighter this weekend to share with you guys, and continuing with the Signatory line, and that is this bottle of Glenlivet, which is something most of you watching, if not all, will be very familiar with, at least by name, being the #1 single malt in the United States, #2 globally behind Glenfiddich. Glenlivet is ubiquitous with single malt. If you're in a bar that only has one single malt, it's usually Glenlivet or often Glenlivet. It's the quintessential Speyside single malt. Glenlivet is often understood as a beginner's single malt. It's one that is a gateway for people to get into single malt, as it is very gentle, classic Speyside, not often heavily sherried, but just mild overall. Really, it is a great intro, that along with Glenfiddich. This expression is aged in one first fill sherry butt. So it is just sherry, they don't do any bourbon. It is 10 years old, distilled on November 21st, 2006, bottled July 31st, 2017. Matured in a first fill sherry butt, cask number 901270 and bottle number 74. It's part of their unchilled filtered collection, so you get really just a great untampered version of the single malt that you would typically get with a standard release. And so when I saw this, Glenlivet is not one I normally go to. I actually have literally never purchased a Glenlivet. Actually, I take that back. I purchased a Glenlivet 18 for my father, which he did enjoy. We both enjoyed, but that's the only Glenlivet I've ever purchased other than this one. And I saw this in first fill sherry, which they do have some first fill sherry, and they have some solely sherried expressions in their lineup, but not one like this. I had tried this with a buyer, and they had their whole spread of samples of everything they had at the time. This was a couple of years ago, and this one stood out to me the most of all the Speyside and the Highlands. And so I picked one up and was pleasantly surprised by it. It definitely gives you a little more insight into what Glenlivet is capable of, other than their entry-level stuff and other than their core range. So let's give it a try. This cork too didn't really last, which is unusual for Signatory corks. They're pretty good. This is a OG Wild Turkey issue. For those of you who know bourbon, know Wild Turkey, very, very common, but still has enough on the sides that it actually kept it pretty good. That only happened recently, and I don't have that much left, as you can see, so it doesn't really matter. But yeah, Glenlivet is one that really is not talked about often, I think because it's so magnificent in the name. This is a distillery that would be used in association with other distilleries because of its name. So for example, you can still find them on bottles today. Cadenhead still does this. It's kind of a throwback, but they will say Glenrothes Glenlivet, or Glenrothes of Glenlivet, Braes of Glenlivet. There'll be different distilleries that will actually put Glenlivet after the name because of its association with it. And that's pretty cool, being that its name alone lends so much heritage to the single malt world, such that other distilleries will want the Glenlivet name attached to their distillery. Now also, the other distilleries are pretty close in proximity to these. You won't find Lefroy Glenlivet, or you won't find Talisker Glenlivet, but within that one Speyside region, you will often find that on independent bottlers and very, very old bottlings. You won't see that anymore. Glenrothes won't do that anymore, and Glenfiddich doesn't do that anymore, but this would be quite common practice back in the day. Even after having this open for a year and a half, which is typically longer than I keep a bottle after opening it, usually. And this is one reason I love Signatory for what they do, non-chill filtered, bottling at 46%. That you just get so much for your money. Vibrant Granny Smith green apples. The apple flesh in particular, you really smell that apple flesh after you've sliced one open. Freshly mixed and diced fruit. Spiced pear and semi-sweet lemon is very, very right after that diced fruit. Like not a sour lemon, but a semi-sweet. So the citrus is a little more sweet. Some applesauce with like a healthy dollop of cinnamon on top. Yep. Just tons of apple, tons of that fresh diced fruit, which is a hallmark quality of Glenlivet. You will find that in many Glenlivets, specifically the not older, the younger ones, before they get into the 20s and up. I suspect a sulphured butt with this, and it's funny, you get with all these fresh fruit notes, you get this sense of Glenlivet, and it's familiar, and then that sulfur hits you, and it's from a bad butt, because you don't normally get that with really any of Glenlivet's core range. Yeah, I mean, the sherry is assertive, but that sulfur, you get it right after you first smell those sherry notes. I mean, it's struck match, zero smoke, but you definitely get that struck match. Very gentle though. It's just inviting. There's nothing off-putting. If you were to pour this for someone who had never had single malt, you probably would win over a single malt drinker who, as opposed to someone who has Johnny Walker Black Label or really anything that's not completely unpeated. And that's, again, testament to why Glenlivet's so popular, and it is such a classic single malt that really gets so many people into single malt. There's a caramel covered apple note, kind of like the ones you get at the fair. Like you get just that fresh caramel that's just covered the apple, still dripping off as you're eating it. Some sour candies on the back end. Really nice, really fresh, vibrant in the palate. Sweet. Spicy. Slightly syrupy. You get more diced fruit. It's not terribly complex, but it's a competent malt. You get the diced fruit, the sherry. Really, it's not overly complex. It's competent. Everything you get in sequential order from the nose basically shows up on the palate. There's all those hallmark Glenlivet notes, but that extra layer of sherry really continues through, being that there's no bourbon in this. Oak notes, and as vague as that sounds, I feel you typically don't. Sherry can overshadow the oak a lot of the times, unlike bourbon casks. But the oak really comes through more on the palate, whereas the nose, the sherry really shines. One more time. Yeah, malty, barley sugars. It's kind of tannin in the back. This tannin note gets slightly bitter into the finish, which I would say is medium. The caramel lingers, but the apples fade away. You're left with the oak, the cask, should I say. More spice. There's some mild smoke too, which I think if you were in a fine smoke in a Glenlivet, it's going to come in the finish, not really on the palate or the nose. And that's really it. It's not a complex finish. I rated this out at an 84.5. I think it's a very good attempt with a Glenlivet, with the cask that they selected. I would normally rate Glenlivets like at around 80, low 80s. So like a low B to a solid B. This one is definitely a solid B. There's really nothing at fault other than the sulfur you can find with this single malt. In saying it's not overly complex, I don't think you should fault a single malt for that. Really, that comes up to the person who's selecting the cask and what cask it was in. I think they did a good job with selecting this. I love that they put it in the first fill sherry. I don't see too many first fill sherries very often. You don't really see many Glenlivets independently bottled, period. So it is quite unusual to find a Glenlivet that's independently bottled. In fact, the last time I saw one before this was like 5 years ago in 2014, 5 years before I selected this, picked this up, 2014, 13. Was the last time I saw one, and I think it was like an old particular. I don't even remember. Oh, no, it was a Cadenhead. That's what it was. And that was in sherry, and that was dark as hell, and around 25 years old. So, but you don't find very many Glenlivets in the independently bottled universe. This one, though, 84.5, I think it was really nice attempt. There's some 11-year-olds still floating around out there, especially in the San Francisco area. I think K&L had some for a while. The 10s I haven't seen in a while, but there was some 11-year-old single barrels done by Signatory, and the price was around $80, $80 to $90 at the time, which I thought was really good for this. Of course, Glenlivet's 12 is going to put you at like $25. So it's, a little over 3 times that. But this is for someone who kind of would like to loop back to Glenlivet maybe a couple years after they've really explored single malt and were first brought on with Glenlivet and want to revisit an old familiar friend. This is definitely a good way to go. Keep an eye out for this one if you're in the Bay Area, because it is at a few shops, like I've said. And so if you want to get your hands on one, absolutely recommend it. Solid B. Cheers.